Well, it's part of the problem that I think a lot of organizations have, which is we have a risk management department and they own the risks. And it's like, no. Everybody owns the risks based on the decisions that they make at their own level. So the CEO has certain decisions that he or she must make. And so they own those risks, typically, the biggest risks to the company.
Mike Tech Studio. Podcast time, baby. The Mike Tech Studios podcast, your source for design, entertainment, marketing, conversation, and content. Mike Tech Studios, make your mark, change the game. With our guest from the All Things Risk podcast, Ben Cattaneo. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning back into our next great episode of the Mike Tech Studios podcast. Men, women, children, dogs, and cats of all ages. We have our podcast topic being risk, what to avoid in business, with our very special guest and actually now a pretty good friend of mine, I may say, Ben Cattaneo. Ben, how's it going, man?
Thanks, Michael. It's going really well, and it's a pleasure to be here on your esteemed podcast.
Esteemed. I like that. Well, I know we had talked initially. We've, ladies and gentlemen, for those listening, Ben and I have probably known each other for, it feels like it's only been, since the beginning of this year or so, but I feel like it's been longer than that. But we did a recent stint on, Ben has an All Things Risk podcast. So for those that are not familiar, Ben is a risk management professional. He's also, as you know, a podcast host. Surprising enough, an endurance athlete and a martial artist, which I always found interesting, and I've never talked about that. He actually works as a chief risk advisor for a major telecoms company in the UK. He has close to 20 years of professional experience in risk management. So, I'm just happy to have you on, man. Happy to have you part of the podcast as well.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be on and to return the favor. We had a great conversation. When was it? About a month ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. So great to be on your show.
Yeah, it was about 2 months ago. And it was funny. We were talking about marketing, but we got into so many other aspects of really just storytelling and, just really sales and all aspects of marketing, really. So I hope it was a good conversation for your listeners as well. Ben, I got to ask you though, man, why risk management? What is it about risk management that just really enticed you to get into it in the first place?
Well, it's a non-linear path that I took to risk management, and it kind of ties in with the conversation we had a couple of months ago, in that the classic risk manager's path, which is really boring and it's not my path, is you become an accountant, and then you get into internal audit, and then you find that that's kind of boring. You thought internal audit was going to be sexy, and then you become a risk person. Mm-hmm. And you do risk stuff, and maybe you worked at the Big Four or whatever. And my path was not that at all. And I'm a polymath. I have some expertise in a variety of different types of things. And I got into risk management because I originally studied and I loved international relations. And that was my kind of academic background. And when I finished my studies, I thought to myself, well, the classic career path there is to work for the government or to join an NGO or work with the UN or something like that. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to do that. I found that to be somewhat limiting. And I thought there's got to be something in business that I could do. And what I looked into, I found, well, there's a thing called political risk, which was all about if a business is doing some work around the world, well, there's all kinds of strange political things that could derail whatever that business is trying to do. It could, coup, it could be a change in policy, it could be a war, it could be all kinds of stuff. And so I got into that, and I got into that via, at the time, there wasn't really a career path in that space. It was more, there were jobs in that space that were attached to security companies, because if you're a big mining or oil and gas company and you're doing business in Southeast Asia or Africa or something like that, you've got to keep your people safe and to identify some of those threats. So whether it's a war, some extortion or something like that, because a lot of these companies have to work in really remote places, you have to understand the politics in a jurisdiction. And that's the kind of work that I started to do, but it was always attached to security. I worked for 6-7 years at a major security company, but my background isn't that. It was political risk. And that led me to more around decision making and how companies and even individuals manage uncertainty and try and become more resilient when things do go wrong. And so that got me closer to risk management. And so now that to make a long story short, now I'm now working in a big corporate here in the UK with a presence in over 180 countries, and helping them manage their risks. But I've done this throughout my career. Everything I've done, I've had different types of roles, and I've worked in corporate sustainability, and I've worked for management consultants, and everything had a risk thread through it. And for me, here's the only certainty in life, and that is that the future is uncertain, and it always will be. And that's regardless of who you are or what you're doing, we have to make decisions under circumstances of uncertainty, perhaps now more than ever. And that's really what I do, is I help organizations and individuals make better decisions and execute in the midst of any type of uncertainty that they're dealing with.
Makes sense. And I know you have traveled around quite a bit. Being in the UK, and I'm kind of poking fun because I already know, but don't really hear a British accent. No. You're not originally from the UK, are you?
No, I'm a Canadian. I grew up in Canada. Well, I was born in Argentina, and I grew up in Canada for the vast majority of my formative years. And then when I graduated from college, I went off and started to work internationally, and I haven't really looked back since. I haven't really lived in Canada apart from 2 years. So I've lived in Southeast Asia, in different parts of Europe, and I've worked in every continent now, except for Antarctica. That's on the bucket list.
I don't think there's risk there. It's just, make sure the penguins are where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, you could freeze to death, I suppose, but I'm sure that, there are some scientists down there, but beyond that, it's there isn't a whole lot of activity.
Listen, man, they're on their own. They know how cold it was down there prior to getting down there. So, I mean, but it's funny that you mentioned about, and I just thought about it, I've had so many recent Canadian guests on, but a handful of people all are coming out of Canada. A lot of great people. So
yeah, we have a lot of great people, and there are a lot of great Canadians that, like me, work outside of Canada, and partially because Canada is actually, it's a small economy. And so the opportunities to do the types of things that I've done are somewhat limited, just given the size of the country. And it's and therefore, that's kind of why. Yeah, it's all about scope, really. But I've loved it. Can't imagine having done anything else. So it's difficult sometimes to, I think, go back, and I find it hard to picture myself working just in a kind of domestic setting in Canada now. But there you go.
Well, it's the same. It's, when you think about it, the same type of situations I would imagine troops that are deployed overseas, and they're in the line of duty, in the line of fire. And then they come back, and sometimes you have a hard acclimation of getting back into civilian life, so to speak. It's just the noise factor, so to speak, is different. And I don't mean, actual noise, but it's just the ambience of everything is it's hard to get acclimated back into.
It is. And I think sometimes when you do work, and I encourage everyone to spend a little bit of time working outside of the country in which they grew up, because your senses are so much more stimulated, everything's sharper, and you learn so much more about yourself and the world. And one of the things is cultural sensitivity. I think my cultural sensitivity is much better than ever would be if I'd stayed in Canada or maybe worked in the US. On that topic of having to come back, I mean, I was ruined very early in my career in terms of I can't do boring work, because my very first
they broke me really early.
My very first assignment in risk management was when I was working for this security and consulting firm, and it was to help a Japanese firm manage an extortion attempt by Maoist rebels in the Philippines.
Wow.
And it was a very interesting project. And that's why I said I'm a bit of a polymath, because there were political dimensions to it, economic dimensions to it, security dimensions to it. And it was fascinating stuff, fascinating work. And when you borrow from different fields and you can really get diverse teams on a particular problem with different types of expertise, you can really help an organization manage its risks. And that started me off. And, from then on, project management gig would be really just, I'd have to maybe shoot myself.
Yeah.
I'd get bored, I'd get, when something just wasn't stimulating me and making me feel passionate about what I'm doing, and then I always felt like it's time to move on.
You definitely want to be folding clothes at the Gap, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's not happening. Well, I mean, it sounds like you've been in a lot of difficult, and I would dare say dangerous scenarios, given, the entirety of the risk factor. Because again, it's like when somebody says design or marketing, there is so many multiple facets to that title or to that topic. What are some of the most dangerous situations that you've found yourself in supporting a company or something of that nature as these different...
Yeah, I tell you what, I've never really felt like I was in a dangerous situation, to be honest, because I always felt that the work that I was doing was very well executed and looked after from a risk management perspective. If you're thinking about itineraries and going to dangerous locations. And I just had a guy on my podcast, Lloyd Figgins, who's a travel risk expert, and you can go just about anywhere almost anywhere. I wouldn't say anywhere, but as long as you take the right sorts of precautions. And so I've never really felt like my life or anything was in danger. I suppose certain situations where I'm getting into a car driving across Guinea or different parts of Western Africa where the road conditions aren't the greatest and you're not really sure about the the roadworthiness of certain vehicles, and what do you do if there's your car breaks down and this sort of thing. But I've never really felt like I've been in danger. This is something that I think is a bit of a paradox. Anyone who does anything that is quote unquote dangerous actually is all over their risks. I mean, they whether we're talking about somebody who's an adventurer. So I had a guy who kayaked the full length of the Amazon, Taryn Kent Hume, on my podcast, and he took loads of precautions, loads of preparation and planning. And so long as you know what you're getting yourself into, and you're doing good planning around it, it's more or less fine. You also have to have some experience as well. So the other thing is you don't just pick up and go. I mean, I've had situations where going to Guinea Conakry, which is a poor country, and they've had some coups and things like that, and then I just found myself in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal, where the connecting flight just didn't make its way through. My bags didn't make their way through. There was an airline strike, and but it was fine. I had a couple of days in Senegal before heading off to Guinea. So long as you've got good local partners or people that have some local knowledge, and you do your homework for most places, then it's fine. And there are some places where you just wouldn't go. You wouldn't go to Afghanistan, but or parts of Iraq or Syria or things like this. But some people do. And it's just it's less a question of risk tolerance and how much you're willing to invest in the right precautions. You might need a whole sort of security detail, and you might think, well, that's just I'm not going to invest in that. So better to just not go. I don't know, apart from maybe journalists, people who do humanitarian work, people in the military, there aren't that many people going to Syria, for example. And those people, they go on these courses, these hostile environments training courses, and they get loads of preparation. They've got all types of precautions, and even then, things can go wrong. But I've never felt
So basically what you're saying is I should cancel my vacation of going to Egypt shortly because it's probably not the best idea right now.
I don't know. It depends on where you're going and what you're going to do there. So, I mean, there are loads of places where, people think, oh, they're quote unquote dangerous, but actually when you look at it, they may not be at all. I wouldn't say that at all. I'd say make sure you have the right precautions and know where you're going, and don't wander the streets at night, streets of Cairo at night when you don't know where you're going or what's around the corner. But if you do, then I think you could go.
I was jerking your chain a little bit. I mean,
I thought you were really going to Egypt.
I was going to say Syria, and it would have been a dead giveaway. But no, I'm
no Egypt. Yeah, I know people who've been to Egypt, and it's absolutely fine. They're loads of wonderful things to see there, obviously. I
wanted to. I had a friend of mine in New Jersey that was going, for whatever reason, they had some friends that they were checking out over there, and there were some really bad political riots and things. This was probably about 2 years ago, when it was like the worst possible time to be Christian, to be in Egypt, and to be, white in that area. And, she wasn't white, but she was going over there, and that was one of the places that I did want to go and check out at, some point, just because, again, there's a lot of rich, historical just monuments and just history there. You have to separate the aspects of what's going on if you can. It wasn't a good time, but I was just jerking your chain with that. But
no. So you can I just say, just do your homework and.
No, I'll just wing it. Just wing it and show up.
But it raises an interesting point across anything that anyone's doing, whether it's marketing or design. We tend to think in absolutes as human beings. What I like to do is help people think in areas of gray, in areas of probability. Sometimes we think, so in absolutes meaning either something's going to happen or it's not. And we're kind of wired this way. So we're wired to make a snap judgment, to think that the rustling in the bushes over there
the tiger is
behind us. It might be exactly. And so we react, or everything's totally fine. And that's not how our world works. Our world works on the basis of shades of gray and probability. So when we're taking decisions and deciding to do things, then it's good to try and attach a level of confidence of how well that thing might work out. So it might be launching a new product, or it might be taking over a company, or whatever it is. Think through the probability of that succeeding. And we're particularly in business, we're overly optimistic. We might think that this has an 80 or 90% chance of success. In reality, it might have a 50, 60% chance. What I encourage people to do is to think in those kind of shades of gray. There's a wonderful book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, who was a poker player. And I had her on my podcast recently. One of the things she encourages people to do, and this is another concept, risk management concept, that Nassim Taleb, if anyone knows Nassim Taleb, he wrote the book, The Black Swan. He's got a recent book out called Skin in the Game. If you're willing to bet your own money on something, that crystallizes your level of confidence. Try to think more in terms of probabilities as opposed to the absolutes. I know you're you're sci-fi fan, so it's the
Sith was the first thing that came out, man. As soon as you said that, only Sith deal in absolutes, and I was like, can't break that.
And we have to be on guard against words like, on both ends of the spectrum, expressions or words like, I'm always, this is, I'm 100% sure that blah, 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 or never, there's no chance, whatever. We should be thinking more in terms of, what do you think? Is it sort of 80%? What is the chance of this working out? If you do your kind of homework and you're confident at 80%, I talk about taking decisions and then trying to be in the zone of disappointment if they don't work out versus the zone of regret. So zone of regret is, I never saw that coming. It's totally wiped me out, whatever. Or I didn't take this chance and I didn't realize that it was actually it would have been so easy to do this. A zone of disappointment is, I knew the risks. We went for it. It didn't work out, but we learn our lessons and we move on. And that's a much better place to be than the zone of regret. So I help people think in those sort of shades of gray, in those areas of probability, and to think through some of the risks that could go wrong, and to think about what might happen if those risks did occur. And rather than stopping us from doing things, I think good risk thinking gives us more confidence and allows us to be successful at whatever we're trying to do. And that's one of the great things. That's one of the things I love about what I get to do professionally and personally as well is to help people have more confidence in the things that they're trying to do.
I agree. And I appreciate that you have that just enjoyability factor personally and professionally. When it comes to, and this is an interesting question I was thinking about. So, I mean, aside from the obvious answer being the CEO, who really owns like the top risks in a company or an organization generally? Who's accountable for those risks or the results? Or
well, it's part of the problem that I think a lot of organizations have, which is we have a risk management department and they own the risks. And it's like, no. Everybody owns the risks based on the decisions that they make at their own level. So the CEO has certain decisions that he or she must make, and they own those risks. Typically, the biggest risks to the company. However, all those folks below the CEO and below those folks and below those folks, they're making decisions as well. And they should be entrusted to make decisions under the auspices of uncertainty. So they would own, the risks at their level, which is, it's always risks to objectives, right? So it's always risks to something. We can't just talk in sort of nebulous terms about risks. It's before we even think about risks, we need to think about, well, what is it we're trying to do? What time horizons? What does success look like? And risks are all the things that could affect those objectives. So, and they could be positive or negative. Typically, we think of risk as something negative, but they could be positive as well. We have too many orders for this product, or we have too many clients, or whatever. Risks are to whatever thing you're trying to achieve. Everybody's got risks. Everybody has risks, whether we're trying to cross the street without looking, or whether or not we're taking a certain way to get to our appointment or whatever. There's risks in everything that we do. So it's everybody owns risk management or owns risks across an organization. The role of someone like me and others that do the sort of thing that I do is to help the organization have a kind of a common language, if you like, so that we're talking apples with apples around risk, and to inject some independent challenge into the fray. And that's very helpful. But you don't necessarily need people like me in an organization. It's helpful to have that, particularly for larger organizations, because you're trying to aggregate different personal approaches to risks in an overall organization. So some people, they like to hang out with friends on the weekends, and other people like to skydive, and trying to bring those different attitudes to risk within an organization, it can be a challenge. So it's important to have a common language. But everyone really, everyone owns risk. And I would say that this applies to our own personal lives as well. We have risks to what we're trying to do as well. And again, all of those things around the extremes of, this will never happen, or this will absolutely happen. We need to avoid those in our daily lives. The tagline of my podcast is "Risk is life," because uncertainty is everywhere. And we need to get better, I think, collectively at being comfortable with uncertainty, and just being able to make those types of difficult calls under the auspices of uncertainty. So in a business setting, I think it's important for everyone to be cognizant of that. And if you ask a good litmus test is to ask anyone within any level of authority and decision-making, what are your top risks, and have a coherent answer around that. I think another thing, just to build on that, and we can talk about this a little bit more, is the role of dissent in an organization. So there are all kinds of we call them cognitive biases. There are all kinds of thinking errors that we make individually or collectively. One of them is confirmation bias. So basically means we've made a decision, or we want something to happen, and we look at all the bits of evidence that confirm what we want or what we believe, and we dismiss all the other bits of evidence. And we can make those types of thinking, this is a big thinking error that we can make in groups, because particularly again in business, most businesses, they kind of favor the optimists, right? It's not the done thing to say, hey, I'm not sure that we're ready to do this or that. And, people get afraid to make those types of call outs because they might be afraid of being told, oh, you're not a team player, or you don't believe in our capabilities or whatever. And that's dangerous. We should be listening to those dissenting voices, not because what they say might is true or not, but it might be. But it's that process of thinking through, well, why might we not be able to successfully launch this product? Why might we not be able to acquire this company? And there's a technique called the pre-mortem, which is basically like a post-mortem, but before it happens. So, and what you do here is you take a decision that you're going to make or something you want to do, and then you assume, all right, it's gone wrong. We didn't succeed. We
didn't plan for it.
The product launch was a disaster, all of this stuff. And then you ask, why did that happen? And you get all the issues on the table. And then you find by doing this, a couple of things. One is that you head off things, you identify things that you didn't think of before, which is the whole point, right? It's better to do a pre-mortem than a post-mortem.
True.
And number two, if you are a bit hesitant, then sometimes it can give you some confidence. Not only will you identify the things that could go wrong, but you might also think about the worst case scenario. You might think, well, actually, that's not so bad. So we could, it would suck, but we'd be able to muddle through it. And this type of activity also, it encourages dissent. So the whole objective is to dissent in a group and to be able to challenge ourselves. It's a very powerful technique that I encourage all businesses and organizations to undertake because again, we are overly optimistic. There's so many examples of businesses getting into things and it's too late and not knowing how to have an exit strategy around a risk that's now manifested.
Well, I find even going back to your initial bit about sometimes a company not really being able to navigate what's going on. They have, like, for example, company culture is a big thing that companies like to throw around. Oh, here at company XYZ, we do this, we do that. But you usually find that the people that are saying it is the people who want it to be that way rather than how the company is really being shown or seen.
Sure.
And it really comes down to, again, who works at that company. So if it's a diversely ethnic company, if the culture is what it is, and absolutely. What I found is that a lot of people like to push, it's more of marketing. They want to believe that their company is like this at X, Y, and Z, and it may not be. And what ends up happening is, like you said, they siphon out what they want to hear and they leave the other things as calculated noise. Oh, that's just, if you're in business, you're going to listen to somebody who is going to tell you what you want to hear. Oh, you're going to make so much money. I had a guy who reached out to me, a sales guy in Google Plus, and he saw my name, he saw my business, and he was just calling and emailing me and telling me how great Google Plus is and how much money I can make. And let's talk and let's do this. Google Plus is not that active of a platform. It's good for certain things, but it is by nothing compared to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. For anybody to even tell me otherwise, it's just really asinine. But he, that was his sale. So he was going to lead almost into deception in order to get that sale. Now, if you look at it reality and realistically, I know, and you and I both know that Google Plus is not that type of platform. And when you're working within a company, sometimes it's best to work within the ranks to really kind of feel what your company
absolutely
is about,
Yeah. They used to talk about, walking the shop floor when those things existed. I suppose they still exist in many organizations, but trying to get a feel for what the vibe is and what people are thinking and saying when, the lights aren't turned on, when the cameras aren't rolling. That's quite valuable. The other thing about what you mentioned there is the role of incentives is crucial in any organization. So if you've incentivized people, if you've given people very unrealistic sales targets, for example, well, guess what? By hook or by crook, they're going to start to try and hit those targets. And that might mean you're going to get into trouble. They might do some untoward things, lie to your customers, or create, sell things at a lower price than you can actually deliver them, all kinds of things. So organizations need to think about how they incentivize their people, because that drives a lot of behavior, and as a result, that can create or mitigate risk. So incentives are huge in any organization, and just hitting some numbers, organizations need to put a little more thought around what the implications are, because I think a lot of this stuff, if organizations just kind of take a step back and think about them and spend a little bit of time just discussing them, maybe at a pre-mortem session or something similar, you could identify it. A lot of risks are just right there. I talk about blind spots versus black swans. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the term black swan. I've mentioned it just earlier, but the black swan event is basically a big game-changing event that no one saw coming. And the reason why it's called the black swan is because in Australia, before they discovered Australia, in Western Europeans used to think that all swans were white, but one observation of a black swan when they discovered Australia negated that, negated millennia of belief that all swans were white. And so that's a black swan event. So black swan events occur, they're rare, but more common to me is something that I call a blind spot, which is a risk or an area, a problem that you can see if you only just shine a light on it. And sometimes we just need to take a step back and just ask ourselves some questions, and you can identify loads of things you didn't see coming. And a lot of it does, as you say, come down to culture in major organizations.
It's funny that you mentioned the Black Swan event, because I mean, I've never personally heard of it. Again, I'm not in risk management, but that was one of my questions. I would imagine that it's also considered, but is a company prepared to respond to extreme events? And that would be, essentially a Black Swan event.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to touch in on, which actually does lead me into my next question, so 2 for 2, is those blind spots that may not be as apparent to a company, an owner, or a business from a first look. In your career, as you've come across them, what are really, I guess maybe 2 you could say, or depending on how crazy they are, maybe just 1. What's been an example of a risk blind spot that you've come across in an organization that was really severe or strange or something like that?
I'll give you a few. I mean, maybe one that really has a similar, well, it's always a similar theme. I used to do a lot of work for mining and oil and gas companies. Those organizations are really staffed by largely engineers and geologists. If you talk to them about their risks, it's always, for me, it always used to be, we don't find enough oil or gold or whatever it is, or the price is too low or whatever it is. I did a project several years ago for a large oil and gas company, and what that one was looking at, helping them understand, they had so many projects that were delayed and had a variety of big cost overruns, particularly the ones in difficult jurisdictions. And it was always the community protests or legal challenges or a range of those kinds of things. And the problem always was that they had people who in their organization that looked at this stuff, but they didn't really get they didn't have a seat at the table. So they had people that could say, look, if we do this, we're going to get a legal challenge here and everything's going to be delayed. And meanwhile, we've hired out all of this equipment and we've told the markets that we're going to produce oil by a certain date, et cetera. They just, even though they had that expertise there, it was the engineers and the geologists that made all the decisions and called all the shots, whereas all this other stuff was a bit of an afterthought. By bringing those folks into the room when they're making these decisions, these investment decisions, it allowed them to say, okay, the local community here doesn't like us. Culturally, we're this nationality, and there's the history there with our, the nationality of our company in this part of Asia or Africa or whatever. So what we might need to do is some local community engagement and outreach, and we might need to think more carefully about sustainability and all kinds of stuff like this. That might take a little bit more upfront cost and time, but ultimately we'll be better off because we'll be able to, to work in concert with them. And so they started to realize that these things weren't an afterthought. It made a difference. I've had loads of examples, just a theme in the early part of my career that just repeated itself, whether that was in Latin America or parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, where the company would assume, right, we've got a license and a permit to do business from the national government, but now we're over here somewhere remote. That isn't enough. Yeah, it's getting. I think it's cyclical, and I think in that industry, it's getting better. Certainly, when you compare it to other businesses. When I look at what happened with Facebook earlier this year, last year, it's the same sort of thing. Really, you didn't think you had all this data that could be used to. I don't want to get too political here, but could be used to influence, potentially elections or whatever. You didn't think that maybe you'd run into a problem with this. It's a similar thing where, you've got people that know their domain, but if you just ask some sensible questions of some people perhaps that have expertise that's not in your core area of expertise, you might identify some things that you probably should have earlier.
I agree. And that comes down to the fact with Facebook, it's like, well, maybe Zuckerberg should have finished college after all, instead of dropping. Probably would have recognized that as Risk Analyst 101, but no, I mean, that absolutely makes sense. And that is something that I do think that a lot of companies even companies here have that disconnect between the workers and the higher ups where, I remember working with a lot of the delivery companies and they wanted to just push higher and higher volumes of packages. But then they were getting upset as the amount of damages that were happening in each of the delivery hubs, and they were lowering the requirements for the drivers. But by doing that, the quality damage per call ratio is going to just skyrocket because, again, you're lowering the threshold of quality by trying to make sure that those peak numbers that you're hitting and those expectations are being hit. It has to come from somewhere, because if you're already running at, optimum efficiency as it is, it just doesn't work that way, Yeah.
So. I hate that expression, do more with less.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, we're going to do less with less.
More. Yeah. You do more with more and you do less with less. Yeah. That's why they call it.
So what are we not going to do? We've got less. What are we not going to do?
Yeah. Something's got to give. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And it's not just the workers. I think there are also areas where outside of the core expertise of the organization, whether you've got those experts in-house or not, if you look at Blockbuster, or if you look at Kodak, the rise of Netflix and what that did to Blockbuster,
mm-hmm.
the rise of digital photography and what that did to Kodak.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that people saw, you just talk to some industry experts and you could deduce perhaps that this is going to be a threat, right? So it's just asking some reasonable, but sometimes tough and uncomfortable questions about the viability of what it is you're trying to do.
Agreed. And the irony of that last statement with Kodak is Kodak was the one that actually developed the digital camera technology first and then buried it because they knew it was going to kill their profits. And then they could have started the revolution themselves and they chose to be greedy. And I mean, again, that's just what happens when you're disconnected with your community, the expectations, and you're not really out there looking at trends and forecasts. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think the larger the organization is, the more it really needs to be connected with, as you say, the wider community, its stakeholders, big trends that are happening, what people care about, all of that stuff.
Agreed. Well, Ben, that's it, man. We're done with the episode. I know it was short and sweet, but
cool. Well, yeah. I hope that your listeners will get something out of it.
Absolutely. Well, you can find Ben on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect up with him if you wish. You can also listen into his podcast directly at allthingsrisk.co.uk, as he's on the other side of the pond. Ben, I really appreciate your time and being on the podcast. Thanks again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Follow all Mike Tech Studios news, podcast content, and topics of interest on social media by searching for Mike Tech Studios on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or your podcast app of choice. Or check out our sister brand Recruitmentary for all of your career resource, job searching, or seeking needs on the recruitmentary.com or youtube.com/recruitmentary platforms. All links for our podcast content can be found on both the Mike Tech Studios website and recruitmentary.com for ease of access. Amazing guests, tips, humor, and stories available on iTunes, Google Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud, and your podcast app of choice. Mike Tech Studios. Make your mark, change the game.